I remember a Tuesday night, somewhere between work and going home, when nobody really wanted to cook. We were standing around a menu, half tired, half joking, and someone said, "I'm getting the burger Bercinois." And then another person said it, and then I said it too. I didn't even look at the price. I don't think anyone did. It wasn't expensive in a dramatic way. It was just the thing everyone was doing. What stuck with me later wasn't the food. It was how quickly my choice stopped feeling like a choice. I didn't feel pressured. I felt included. That felt good in the moment. Later that night, scrolling through my bank app, I noticed the charge and thought, yeah, that tracks. It always does. That's the strange part. Nothing felt reckless. Nothing felt wrong. It just felt automatic. And once I noticed that, I couldn't unnotice how often my money moved that way. Over time, I started realizing that group plans almost never drift cheaper. It's not malicious. It's just momentum. Coffee turns into drinks. One round turns into two. Driving turns into a rideshare because parking is annoying and nobody wants to deal with it. Each decision makes sense on its own. That's what makes it hard to see. I tell myself I was just being easygoing. Low maintenance. The guy who doesn't make things complicated. What I didn't label at the time was how consistent those choices were. If something cost a little more but kept the vibe smooth, that's where we landed. And month by month, those little more moments stacked up quietly. I never felt like I was overspending. I just felt a little tighter than I expected to feel. I didn't connect those two things for a long time. I thought that feeling was just life. I used to tell myself that saying yes was cheaper than being awkward. That was the math in my head. If everyone wanted to go out, splitting a bill felt easier than explaining why I didn't feel like it. No speech, no pause, no weird looks. I'd think, it's $30, relax. What I didn't factor in was how often that calculation happened. Once or twice, it's nothing. But when it's every week, sometimes twice a week, that's not nothing anymore. I remember opening my credit card statement and feeling this dull confusion. I wasn't buying anything exciting. I wasn't living large. I was just agreeing over and over. The awkwardness I avoided lasted maybe 5 seconds. The charge sat there all month. That was the part I didn't really want to look at first. There's this strange way group subscriptions happen. Somebody signs up for something, a streaming service, an app, a tool everyone's supposed to use. At first it's shared, then passwords get messy. Then someone says, I'll just get my own. That someone was usually me. $8 or $9 here, $15 there. I remember noticing one charge I didn't even recognize anymore. I had to think back to why I signed up in the first place. It was for a group thing that hadn't existed in months. I didn't cancel it because the money didn't hurt enough to demand attention. That's the dangerous zone. When a cost is small enough to ignore but permanent enough to stick around. I wasn't paying for the service anymore. I was paying to avoid thinking about it. Splitting checks evenly always felt like the polite thing to do. Nobody wants to pull out a calculator at the table. Nobody wants to be the person saying, actually, mine was less. I'd order something simple. Someone else would order a couple drinks and an appetizer, and when the server dropped the check, we just divided up. I told myself it all evens out over time. I'm not sure that was true. What was true is that I paid extra a lot more often than I admitted. It never felt like losing money. It felt like buying smoothness, buying the absence of tension. But later, when I looked at how much eating out cost me in a month, I couldn't remember half the meals. I just remembered the total. And the total didn't care that I was trying to be easy to be around. I noticed this shift in what felt normal. A nicer apartment for a group trip, better seats at a game, a slightly upgraded rental car because it was only a little more each. Nobody ever said we had to. It just felt like that's what adults did. At some point, I realized my baseline had moved without my permission. The version of me from a few years earlier would have flinched at those prices. The current version just nodded. I didn't feel rich. I didn't feel reckless. I just felt quietly stretched. And that feeling didn't come from one big decision. It came from 100 small ones that all leaned in the same direction. Pushed there by people I liked and didn't want to slow down. Group chats have a way of moving fast. Someone throws out an idea, a couple people react, and suddenly it's a plan. Dates, times, links. I noticed how often I said yes before I checked anything. Not my calendar, not my balance, just yes. I told myself I'd figure it out later. Later usually meant hoping it would work out. There were nights I realized halfway through the week that I'd already committed to spending money I hadn't really accounted for. Nothing catastrophic. Just enough to make the rest of the month feel tighter. I didn't connect that tension to the moment I said yes. That moment felt social, friendly, generous. The stress showed up quietly later when the group chat was already on to the next thing. It wasn't just the obvious costs. Gas, parking, tolls. Those added up too, especially when plans started spreading farther out. A dinner across town. A meetup that wasn't really convenient for anyone but sounded fun. Each trip came with little charges that didn't feel like part of the event, even though they were. I'd get home late, tired, and notice I'd spent more just getting there than I expected. It didn't feel wasteful. It felt like the price of being flexible. But flexibility has a cost, especially when it's one-sided. I started noticing how drained I felt after these nights. Not just socially, financially. Like my money and my energy were tied together more than I realized. At some point, I stopped suggesting cheaper options altogether. I didn't announce it, it just happened. If someone said sushi, I didn't mention the taco place down the street. If someone suggested a weekend trip, I didn't bring up staying local. I told myself I was being agreeable, easy, grown up. The truth was, I didn't want to be the person who slowed things down or made it about money. I didn't want that look, the subtle pause. So I stayed quiet. What I didn't realize then was that silence has a price tag. Every time I swallowed an alternative, I paid for it later. Not dramatically, just in this low-grade pressure that followed me around. I wasn't angry at anyone else. I was mostly uncomfortable with myself. There was a night when I finally did the math, and I wish I hadn't. One weekly habit with friends, nothing wild, just dinner and a couple drinks, averaged about $40. I'd always thought of it as a small splurge. $40 doesn't sound like much, but $40 once a week is about $160 a month. That's nearly $2,000 a year. When I saw that number, my stomach dropped a little. Not because it ruined me, but because it was invisible until I lined it up like that. $2,000 for something I couldn't even clearly remember enjoying every time. The math wasn't complicated. That was the unsettling part. I hadn't avoided it because it was hard. I'd avoided it because it was uncomfortable. For a long time, I framed those expenses as investments in relationships. That sounded mature in my head. Money comes and goes, but friendships matter, right? And I still believe that, mostly. What I didn't want to admit was how often that logic protected me from asking harder questions. Some nights were genuinely great. Others blended together. I couldn't always tell which was which afterward. The charges looked the same either way. I remember scrolling through a statement and trying to attach memories to certain amounts and coming up blank. That bothered me more than the spending itself. If I was really investing, I should have been able to feel it. Instead, it felt like emotional accounting had replaced financial accounting, and the numbers were still there, whether the memories were or not. Things got trickier when someone in the group started making more money. Nobody said it out loud, but the pace changed. Nicer places, bigger plans, everything still framed as reasonable, split evenly. I noticed myself adjusting without being asked, matching the new normal. I didn't want to be the one who couldn't keep up. Pride filled the gap where honesty should have been. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd catch up. What I didn't say was that catching up meant quietly stretching myself thinner. I smiled through it. I showed up. And then I went home and stared at numbers that didn't line up with how effortless I'd tried to make it look. Birthdays and weddings have their own kind of gravity. Group gifts, shared expenses, destination plans that start sounding less optional the longer they're discussed. I remember chipping in for things I didn't feel strongly about. Telling myself it was just part of being an adult. Nobody was forcing me. That was the tricky part. Obligation didn't arrive loudly. It showed up dressed like generosity. Over time, the amounts got bigger. And so did this quiet resentment I didn't like admitting to myself. I wasn't upset at the people. I was uncomfortable with how automatic my yes had become. Celebrations are supposed to feel warm. Sometimes afterward, all I felt was this low hum of stress that I couldn't really explain to anyone. Convenience multiplied when we were together. One ride home instead of figuring out buses. Late night delivery because nobody wanted to cook after being out. Last minute bookings because planning felt like work. These were the easiest decisions to justify. They also added up faster than anything else. I noticed how forgettable they were. I couldn't recall the food. I barely remembered the ride. But the charges were there, clean and clear. Convenience has this way of erasing the experience while keeping the cost. I started to realize that some of the most expensive habits in my life were also the least memorable, especially when they happened in a group. There was a thought I kept stepping around for a while, mostly because I didn't like where it pointed. A lot of the time, I wasn't really going with the group. I was using the group as cover. Cover for choices I already suspected weren't great for me. It felt easier to say, well, everyone's doing it, than to admit I just didn't want to be the odd one out. That realization sat heavy when it finally landed. Not in a dramatic way, just this quiet discomfort that stuck around. I couldn't blame anyone else anymore. Nobody was dragging me along. I was walking with them willingly, even when part of me knew I'd feel it later. That was the part I avoided looking at. Because once you see that, it's harder to pretend it's all just social math. I started noticing patterns when I looked back at old credit card statements. Not patterns around things I needed, patterns around people. Certain names in my phone lined up with certain types of charges. Dinners, drinks, rides, weekends. It was oddly predictable. Seeing it laid out like that made me uncomfortable, not because it was shocking, but because it was obvious in hindsight. I wasn't surprised by any single charge. I was surprised by how consistent they were, how little variation there was. It made me wonder how long I'd been running the same script without realizing it. I didn't suddenly fix anything after noticing. I just couldn't unsee the connection anymore, and that alone felt heavier than I expected. One thing that stood out once I started paying attention was how rarely money limits came up directly in groups. We talked about time, energy, schedules, but not numbers. Silence filled that space, and silence has a way of turning into assumptions. I assumed everyone else was fine. Everyone else probably assumed the same about me. Inside, I felt this quiet pressure I never named. I'd laugh, nod, agree, and then feel a little isolated later, staring at my account like it was a private problem I wasn't allowed to bring into the room. Being surrounded by people didn't make that feeling smaller. If anything, it made it sharper. I was part of everything, but alone with the math, that disconnect lingered longer than any single expense. I remember the first time I opted out of something small. Not a big statement, just a casual, I'm going to sit this one out. There was a brief pause. Someone said, all good, and the conversation moved on. That was it. No fallout, no damage. What surprised me wasn't how easy it was. It was how rare I'd allowed myself to try. The discomfort I'd been avoiding turned out to be mostly internal. I still felt it, but it was quieter than the stress I usually carried afterward. That stuck with me, not as a lesson, more like a question. Why had I built this whole story around what might happen, without checking if it was even true? For a long time, going with the group felt like part of being an adult. Busy schedules, full calendars, spending money like you belonged there. I absorbed that image without realizing it. Somewhere along the way, adulthood started looking expensive by default. I didn't question that. I just adjusted myself around it. Looking back, I can see how much of my identity got tied up in keeping pace. Being the guy who could hang, who didn't make things weird. That identity had a cost, even if it didn't show up all at once. It showed up gradually as this low-level unease that followed me around, asking questions I didn't really have answers for yet. The other night, I scrolled past an old group chat I hadn't opened in a while. Plans that never happened. Jokes that landed months ago. And right below it, a charge tied to that same stretch of time. A small number, not dramatic, just sitting there. It made me pause longer than I expected. I wasn't upset, I wasn't nostalgic either. It just felt quiet, like noticing the echo of something after everyone's already gone home. I closed the app and sat there for a minute, thinking about how many of those numbers were attached to moments I barely remembered, and how clearly I remembered the feeling of being stretched. That part lingered.